What's up, geeks and gamers? It's Odin coming back with a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw the new release Strange World from Walt Disney coming out to be a massive financial failure, a massive flop, and even the shill media cannot cover up this very fact. So we'll talk about Strange World. How bad is the damage looking like for this movie? We'll also talk about another film from Sony that actually is opening up as a flop as of this point as well, called Devotion. Apparently it's a film about the Korean War, so interesting to see that film also not making a whole lot of money. But what is making money? Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, and is now officially past the break-even point and has now made around $30 million in net gain profits. As I've been saying for a long time now, people I think were sleeping on the domestic totals for this movie, and sure enough, this past weekend, not only because of Thanksgiving, but also with the weekend numbers themselves only dropping 31% from last weekend. Obviously helped with the holiday there, but still, the fact still remains that the film did well. Regardless of that, we have to then look into this, and we have to therefore state the fact that this film has indeed caught the domestic numbers for Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness, and so therefore the chance of it ending with a much higher domestic number than Multiverse is very likely. Now, what we are seeing, though, is internationally, though the film added about another $30 million or $40 million in those international markets, which is below about $20 million or so less than the $50 million or so it added last weekend. It does show us that the money is still coming in internationally to such a degree that we can't rule out the possibility of this film doing much better in the long term. So obviously, my thought is now probably looking at the movie getting somewhere between $850 and $950 when all is said and done. Some people are still holding out some hope, people who actually like the film. I don't quite understand how they can like the film because it's a long, boring movie. But with all that being said, there are still some people out there who say, hey, maybe we could see the film end up holding on long enough to get to $1 billion. I don't really see that at this point in time. I don't think the numbers are really there for it. What I do see, though, is this film outperforming, doing better than what Doctor Strange 2 did, and also doing quite well internationally versus what some people had probably initially thought. So let's go ahead and dive into these numbers. But of course, the big news has to do not only with Black Panther, but also with Strange World. So Strange World opened to $27.8 million. The problem, though, this film cost around $180 million. Meaning that this film is set to be a massive flop, likely losing well over $100 million for Disney, and it just continues to show that it's not because of any wokeness in this specific film, right? I think some people are wrongly attributing that as the factor as to why the film isn't doing well. They clearly put this film out up against Black Panther in its third week of release, Black Panther's third week of release, in order for this film to basically be forgotten about. So it seems that Disney knew that this film wasn't really all that good, and so therefore they threw it into this weekend saying, well, maybe because it's Thanksgiving, some families will actually go to see it, so we might as well try and make as much money off of it as we can over this weekend, knowing that most people are still going to go see Black Panther, as we saw from those numbers that were just mentioned, and also that we don't really think this film is going to do all that well in the first place. So anyone who's going to try and say that this film is doing poorly because it specifically is woke in a certain way, obviously, I recognize that there are certain characters in the film that they're bringing in the LGBTQAI plus whatever the acronym is now agenda into their actual storytelling. And does that have an impact? Sure. But to say that that's the sole or even primary reason as to why the film isn't doing well is just not really all. It's really not all that there. I mean, the fact also is that the marketing for this film was either non-existent, or when it did exist wasn't really all there in the first place. I look at this poster and still have no idea what it's about. I never even saw a trailer for this movie, even after seeing some films in theaters. And so it makes you ask the question, were they really trying to have this film make money? Or were they just basically trying to throw it out and see what happens and end up biting the loss? Because, as I said, they're looking at around $100+ million loss for that film. But it's not all bad news for Disney. As I said, Black Panther: Wakanda Forever made $45.9 million over the Thanksgiving weekend, 31% drop from last weekend. So very impressive numbers there. It's getting very close to, by the end of next weekend, likely getting to $400 million. And this is all before the next Avatar film is set to come out. Strange World opening up to 11.9 is really, really bad. I would not be surprised based off of the fact that even critics aren't going gaga for this movie either. It seems that this film is likely going to have a pretty massive drop next week, and with a very slow start, that is not good news for them going forward, especially with that, again, massive $180 million budget that they had for it. Sony Pictures had a $90 million film in Devotion, again, as a film set, I believe, during the Korean War. This movie also not opening all that well, $6 million domestic, off a $90 million budget. That is pretty catastrophic, to say the very least. And then rounding out the top 5, we have The Menu, making $5.2 million in its second weekend, dropping 42%. So not the worst drop in the world, but based off of how much this film cost, the chances of the film making its money back not really seeming all that likely, especially when we have in a couple of weeks films like Avatar 2 set to come out, which are going to take up the box office in a very large way. Now, do I think Avatar 2 has a chance of being as successful as the first one? Absolutely not. I think that enough people have kind of woken up to the fact that the first film sucked. Story-wise, other than people saying, oh, well, it looked pretty. That really is the only defense that I ever hear for the actual movie itself as an actual film. It seems that based on the trailers that have been released, based off of the general sentiment that people have for the film, obviously there are still people who love the first film. I'm not saying that they don't exist, and there are some people that are genuinely excited for it. But regardless of any of that, the fact that the film cost upwards of $350 to $400 million because he went way over budget, keep in mind that when they originally were making the deal, when Disney was originally making the deal with James Cameron, they were giving him $1 billion to make 4 Avatar films. But based off of what's being reported, the movie is set to cost somewhere between $350 and $400 million, meaning let's say it costs towards that higher end, the film will need to make about $1 billion to break even. Some people have been throwing around, oh, it needs to make $2 billion to break even or $2.5 billion to break even. That would be if you look at the entire franchise as far as how much money they initially gave James Cameron, the $1 billion they gave to him. And the fact that, again, 2.5 times the production budget is the typical break-even point for a movie. And so, again, that means all the films together would collectively have to make $2.5 billion in total. But knowing now that this second one that's set to come out in December costs a lot more, again, based off of what the initial breakdown, it should have cost, each film should have theoretically cost around $250 million based off how much they gave him. It seems that they're giving him extra money to be able to do whatever he wants. So the question's going to be, especially since he's filming them all around the same time, these films are being made. All of these films are being finished around the same time as far as the principal photography is concerned. So the real question is, how much money have they actually sunk into this project already? And if this film is not nearly as successful as the first, and then it has an even more massive drop-off in the third film in the franchise set to come out in a year or two, that again raises the questions about whether or not it's worth their investment. Probably not. And also whether or not the film is ultimately going to be a success or not. But again, we will talk about that film a lot more when the actual numbers themselves come out. Going into the individuals, as you can see, there was actually an error earlier. The numbers was reporting this film had gotten to $675 million internationally. I said, wait a minute, that's not right. They were saying it had already made over $1 billion. Clearly, that's not the case. 675, though, at this point, 3 weeks into the release, is still pretty good. As I mentioned, it was going to catch up to Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness, and as you can see, even though it's at the lower end of this 5-year tracking, it has caught up. It's no longer below that line. And looking at the actual versus Doctor Strange numbers there, 367 is where currently Black Panther Wakanda Forever is versus the 342 where this film was. And so let's say that this film even only makes another $10 million over the next week, which it's likely going to make a lot more than that, just on the individual days added together, let alone the next weekend. This film will continue to be ahead of this film. Again, 370 was where Black Panther, or rather where Doctor Strange 2 was at the end of its 4th week. This film's already going to reach that within the next few days, and so that's the reason why, as I said, this film's going to catch up to it. This film is going to be, don't sleep on the domestics. I told people about that, and some people took it seriously, some people didn't. So knowing that, that means the film is going to go well past the $411 million that Doctor Strange had made, and that's why I'm thinking that this film getting close to $500 million domestic is absolutely a realistic possibility. Looking at the international numbers, though, right, this film is now at $307.9 million versus the $540 of Doctor Strange. I don't see that film catching up there necessarily, but based on the fact that it's 3 weeks out and at $307.9 million, I would say that $350 to $400 million internationally is still very much in the cards for the movie. And because of that, that's the reason why I'm thinking the film is going to make somewhere between $850 and $950 when all is said and done. Those are just where the numbers are. And even if it doesn't get to that point, it has still made its money back and will be a lot more profitable than Thor: Love and Thunder, which only made around $50 million in net game profits and will not get anywhere close to the profitability of that of even Doctor Strange 2 because it got up to $950 million. But again, we'll have to wait and see. The fact that the film costs a lot more than Doctor Strange is the reason as to why that is the case. Strange World, as I had mentioned, $27.8 million worldwide off a $180 million budget. Not very good at all. $9 million domestically, even though Glenn Powell is in the film, and I remember him from Top Gun, and he was pretty fun in that. This is an aerial war epic based on the best-selling book of the same name. telling the story of 2 elite U.S. Navy pilots during the Korean War. So apparently just not a lot of people are interested in this film. Doesn't mean that the film's guaranteed to flop, but it's not looking good based off of a $90 million budget. We also have the sequel to Knives Out. That's right, everyone. Everyone's favorite director, Rian Johnson, has come out with a sequel. Keep in mind, Netflix gave him around $400 million. They purchased, basically, Rian Johnson to make 2 films, if I'm not mistaken, two follow-ups to Knives Out. They spent $400 million on it, which makes no sense to me whatsoever, because apparently the reported budget on this movie was only $40 million. So they gave this money just for the IP, I guess, thinking that it would be worth it in the long run. And even though, based off of the initial release theatrically, it got a 1-week preview theatrically before it goes onto Netflix exclusively, even though it did well in the markets that it came out in, and did well domestically because of that $13.3 million in around hundreds of screens, is a very good per theater ratio. The fact that they're not going to get any money really back from the box office, and again, how do you even quantify what is successful on Netflix or not? I honestly don't know, because you're not really selling ad space there, and unless you're counting new members who only sign up to see this movie, how do you even get to that point of saying they only saw this movie, or people who stayed to only see this movie? The way of quantifying that makes no sense to me whatsoever. And so even though people are going to try and say, oh, the film's doing so very well, and they should have had a theatrical release for it, which might be true. Again, the first film did make a lot more than people expected. I just don't quite understand, because ultimately this film, even at $40 million, I don't think it's going to be enough to make its money back, at least theatrically, especially since some reports are that that Netflix offered a very good deal to theaters to host this film for a week, saying that they would only get about 40% of the returns, which is a pretty good deal for a brand new film release as such. So we'll have to wait and see, I guess, what they would do report about this film. We also have the second week numbers, as I mentioned, for The Menu. This film is looking like it might lose some money, but again, it is trending upwards, so maybe it will be able to have legs to be able to pull out of that historical standard. Black Adam, $378 million, is still a financial flop. Really not all that surprised there at this point. Also, the film She Said, expected to be a massive flop as well. This dealing with the hashtag #MeToo era, so again, couldn't happen to a nicer group of people. Going to my box office charting, because we all have a love for charting, I would say. At least I do. If you look at the week 2 numbers for The Menu, based on the fact that it's made $33.4 million worldwide, I project it to make somewhere between $47 and $66 million when all is said and done. For She Said, somewhere between $9 and $12 million when all is said and done. Based off of those budgets, I am projecting that the film The Menu will likely lose money somewhere between $16 and $4 million, but as you can see, if it is able to have strong legs, which, hey, very well it could have good word of mouth, could end up, kind of being that sleeper success. This happens sometimes with films like this. It could end up doing better, meaning that it could more than double its money over the last 2 weeks. And so if it does that, then we're looking at this film getting to the break-even point. That would mean it would be closer to this number here. But again, even if it does double it, it would still be a financial loss, which is why I think that's the most likely scenario. She Said is pretty much guaranteed to be a financial failure at $42 to $40 million in financial losses. Going into the numbers, though, for Strange World, again, we'll have to wait for the week 2 numbers to officially give some projections. But as of right now, the film is around $253.3 million in the red. And again, that comes from the fact that the production cost was just $180 million, taking into account typical marketing cost and the actual typical return for films. Yeah, Strange World expected to lose a ton of money. Would not be surprised if this film ends around $200 million in the red for it. Devotion, though, as I said, as well for Sony in this case, $129.5 million in the red currently. I don't see that film really getting out of that point, unless it sees some very impressive numbers as of next weekend. And also, as we can see, Black Panther: Wakanda Forever at $675 million has passed the $625 million break-even point, which means the film is now $30.3 million in the black. As you can see, compared to its first 2 weeks, it's around 80%. So I think that this film will probably end up being somewhere in the 60s, which would be ultimately a pretty average showing for a film. And it's going to be because it's going to perform much better than expected domestically, outperforming really what it should domestically, which I said was going to happen, and then getting kind of a basically by the numbers international release, at least at this point in time. Whether or not the Bob Iger coming on back as CEO, right as the top of Disney, is going to have an impact, or whether this film ever sees a China release or anything like that is anyone's guess. But yeah, this film coming in well underneath the $1.3 billion of the first, but still coming in well enough to being a much better film and a much better performing film than I think some people were giving it crap for last weekend after reporting on the Friday to Friday drop. I think the Thanksgiving numbers have clearly demonstrated this film is being seen by people and that there is definitely an audience for this. But those are the numbers as they stand. As you can see, also Black Adam still a flop at this point. What are y'all's thoughts about these numbers? Let me know in the comment section down below. You'll see a much fuller box office breakdown over on my channel, OMB Reviews. Anyway, you guys are all amazing, beautiful people. Make sure you smash the like button, light the fire button, and honestly, smash the rumble button as you're watching us over there. You're all amazing, beautiful people. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Have a blessed first Sunday of Advent, and as always, God bless.